Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the spring of 1992, a chilling pattern emerged across the American Midwest. Small businesses along Interstate 70 became hunting grounds for a methodical killer who targeted store employees working alone. 6 victims in 3 states, all shot with the same .22 caliber weapon, all murdered within a single month. The perpetrator would become known as the I-70 killer, and despite one of the most extensive multi-state investigations in history, he vanished without a trace. Today, we'll explore how this phantom predator terrorized the heartland, and why, after more than 3 decades, his identity remains one of crime's most baffling mysteries. Let's dive into the case that continues to haunt investigators to this day. The spring of 1992 brought with it a wave of terror that swept across the American Midwest. A killer was on the loose, methodically targeting small businesses along the Interstate 70 corridor, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The murders were calculated, cold, and carried out with chilling precision. The perpetrator would come to be known as the I-70 killer, and his crime spree would baffle law enforcement agencies across multiple states for decades. On April 8, 1992, in Indianapolis, Indiana, 26-year-old Robin Fuldauer was working alone at a Payless shoe source store just off Interstate 70. It was a Wednesday, typically a slow day for retail. At some point during her shift, a customer entered the store. But this wasn't an ordinary shopper. The individual pulled out a .22 caliber weapon and shot Robin at close range. Her body was discovered later that day by a customer who had entered the store and found no one attending the register. Robin's death marked the beginning of what would become one of the most perplexing serial murder cases in Midwestern history. Just 5 days later, on April 13th, the killer struck again. This time, the target was Wichita, Kansas, approximately 600 miles west of Indianapolis. Patricia Smith, 23, and Patricia Magers, 32, were working at La Bridal, a bridal shop located near I-70. It was close to closing time when a man entered the store, claiming he needed to pick up a tuxedo. The women explained that they didn't rent tuxedos, but the man produced a gun and shot both women execution style. Their bodies were discovered by Patricia Magers' fiancé, who had come to pick her up after work. He immediately called the police. Unlike the Indianapolis crime scene, the Wichita murders provided investigators with their first potential lead. A customer had entered the bridal shop shortly after the killings occurred and encountered the suspect leaving the store. This witness provided police with a description. A white male in his mid-30s, slender build, about 5'7", tall, with reddish or light brown hair. The witness described the man's hair as wild or disheveled. This description would later form the basis for the composite sketch that would be circulated throughout the Midwest. The killer's pattern was becoming clear. He targeted small businesses near major highways, specifically I-70. His victims were primarily young women working alone or in pairs. The murders occurred during business hours, and the motive didn't appear to be robbery, as cash registers were often left untouched. The murder weapon was consistently identified as a .22 caliber firearm, likely a pistol. On April 27th, just 2 weeks after the Wichita murders, the killer traveled approximately 240 miles east to Terre Haute, Indiana. Michael McCown, 40, was working at Sylvia's Ceramics, a shop owned by his mother. McCown had long hair that he wore in a ponytail, and investigators would later theorize that the killer may have mistaken him for a woman from behind. Following the same pattern, the killer entered the store during business hours and shot McCown with the same .22 caliber weapon. His body was discovered by his mother when she returned to the shop. The inclusion of a male victim initially confused investigators, but the similarities in the crime scene, the proximity to I-70, and the ballistic evidence linking the murder weapon to the previous killings confirmed this was the work of the same individual. The killer's willingness to adapt his victim profile while maintaining his operational methods demonstrated a level of flexibility that made him even more dangerous and unpredictable. 3 days later, on April 30th, the killer struck again, this time in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Nancy Kitzmiller, 24, was working alone at Boot Village, a Western boot store located in a strip mall near I-70. Following his established pattern, the killer entered the store during business hours, shot Nancy with the same .22 caliber weapon, and left without taking anything of significant value. Her body was discovered by customers who entered the store and found no one attending to them. The final confirmed victim in the original I-70 series was Sarah Blessing, 37. On May 7, 1992, Blessing was working at a store called the Store of Many Colors in Raytown, Missouri, a suburb of Kansas City. Like the previous victims, Blessing was alone when the killer entered her store. She was shot with the same .22 caliber weapon, and her body was discovered by customers. The Store of Many Colors was located near I-70, fitting the killer's established geographical pattern. In less than a month, the I-70 killer had claimed 6 lives across 3 states. The murders shared striking similarities. Small businesses near I-70, victims primarily working alone, execution-style shootings with a .22 caliber weapon, and little to no evidence of robbery being the primary motive. These commonalities led investigators to conclude they were dealing with a single perpetrator traveling along the interstate. Law enforcement agencies from Indiana, Kansas, and Missouri formed a task force to coordinate their investigations. The FBI became involved, providing resources and expertise in serial murder cases. Despite the collaborative effort, the killer had left behind minimal physical evidence: no fingerprints, no DNA, no significant witnesses beyond the one in Wichita. The composite sketch based on the Wichita witness's description became the most valuable tool in the investigation, circulated widely across the Midwest in hopes that someone would recognize the suspect. Behavioral analysts from the FBI developed a profile of the killer. They suggested he was likely a white male in his 20s or 30s, of average to below average height, socially awkward but capable of functioning in society without drawing attention to himself. They theorized he might have a connection to the retail industry, given his targeting of small shops. The analysts also suggested the killer might be using I-70 for his job, possibly as a truck driver, traveling salesman, or someone whose work required regular travel along this corridor. The geographical and temporal patterns of the killings suggested the perpetrator was moving west to east along I-70, then doubling back. The spacing between murders indicated he might be stopping in these locations as part of a regular route, rather than making special trips solely to commit murders. This led investigators to focus on individuals whose occupations required travel along I-70 during the spring of 1992. The task force received thousands of tips from the public. Each potential lead was investigated, but none produced a viable suspect who matched both the physical description and had the opportunity to commit all 6 murders. The case began to cool as weeks turned into months, with no new incidents fitting the I-70 killer's pattern. However, the story took an unexpected turn when investigators in Texas began to notice similarities between the I-70 murders and a series of killings in their state. On September 25, 1993, approximately 16 months after the last confirmed I-70 murder, Mary Ann Glasscock, 51, was shot to death while working alone at an antique store in Fort Worth, Texas. The murder weapon was a .22 caliber firearm, and the circumstances closely resembled the I-70 cases. Less than a month later, on October 15, 1993, Amy Vess, 22, was killed while working alone at a dancewear shop in Arlington, Texas. Again, the murder weapon was a .22 caliber firearm, and the circumstances matched the I-70 killer's methodology. Then, on November 1st, 1993, Vicki Webb, a boutique clerk in Fort Worth, was shot by a man fitting the I-70 killer's description. Unlike the previous victims, Webb survived the attack and was able to provide police with a description that closely matched the composite sketch from the Wichita case. The Texas murders occurred along Interstate 35, not I-70, but the similarities were striking enough for investigators to consider them linked. The killer seemed to have shifted his hunting ground, but maintained his methodology, targeting women working alone in small shops, using a .22 caliber weapon, and showing little interest in robbery. The Texas cases became known as the I-35 murders, and investigators from both the I-70 and I-35 task forces began sharing information. Forensic analysis of the bullets recovered from both series of murders provided compelling evidence of a connection. The bullets from the I-70 murders and the Texas killings shared distinct markings that suggested they were fired from the same weapon or, at minimum, the same model of weapon. This ballistic evidence strengthened the theory that the same individual was responsible for both series of murders. The survivor from the Texas attacks, Vicki Webb, provided investigators with additional details about the suspect. She described him as soft-spoken but confident, carrying a small caliber handgun that he held in his right hand. Webb's account aligned with the behavioral profile developed by the FBI, painting a picture of a methodical killer who approached his victims with a disarming demeanor before attacking. As the investigation continued, law enforcement agencies expanded their search parameters. They began looking at similar unsolved murders in other states, particularly those involving small businesses and .22 caliber weapons. This broader approach led to the identification of several cases that might be connected to the I-70 I-35 killer. One such case was the murder of Sylvia Cool, 36, who was killed on May 7, 1993, while working at a gift shop in Greenville, South Carolina. The circumstances of Cool's murder, a small business, a female employee working alone, a .22 caliber weapon, bore similarities to the I-70 and I-35 cases. However, Greenville was located far from both interstate corridors, making a definitive connection difficult to establish. Another potential case was the murder of Kelly Gassaway, 24, who was killed on April 10, 1994, while working at a video store in Hannibal, Missouri. Again, the circumstances resembled the I-70 killer's methodology, but Hannibal was located along the Mississippi River, not near I-70. Without conclusive ballistic evidence linking these cases to the confirmed I-70 I-35 murders, they remained classified as possibly related rather than definitively connected. The investigation faced numerous challenges. The killer's mobility made it difficult for any single law enforcement agency to maintain continuity in the investigation. The lack of physical evidence limited the application of emerging forensic technologies. And as time passed, witnesses' memories faded, potential leads grew cold, and the trail of the I-70 killer became increasingly difficult to follow. Despite these challenges, investigators remained committed to solving the case. They periodically reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and explored new investigative techniques as they became available. The advent of DNA analysis offered some hope, but the I-70 killer had left behind little biological evidence at his crime scenes, limiting the utility of this technology. The composite sketch remained the most recognizable piece of evidence in the case. It depicted a white male with disheveled reddish-brown hair, a thin face, and a bony nose. This image was circulated widely across the Midwest and Texas, appearing on wanted posters, in newspapers, and on television programs dedicated to unsolved crimes. Despite its widespread distribution, the sketch failed to produce a definitive identification of the killer. As the years passed, the I-70 case became one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The killer had claimed at least 6 lives, possibly more, across multiple states, evaded capture, and seemingly disappeared without a trace. The randomness of his victims, the geographical spread of his crimes, and the minimal evidence he left behind made him an enigma to investigators and the public alike. The families of the victims were left with unanswered questions and an absence of closure. They formed support networks, held memorial services, and advocated for continued attention to the case. Their persistence helped keep the I-70 murders in the public consciousness, even as other high-profile crimes captured headlines. Law enforcement agencies maintained the case files as active investigations, unwilling to relegate the I-70 murders to the cold case archives. They periodically released updated information to the media, hoping to generate new leads or jog the memories of potential witnesses. Television programs like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted featured segments on the I-70 killer, reaching millions of viewers and generating hundreds of tips. Each tip was investigated, but none led to the identification of the killer. The I-70 case also became a subject of study for criminologists and forensic psychologists. They analyzed the killer's methodology, victim selection, and geographical patterns, developing theories about his motivations and background. Some suggested he might have had a troubled relationship with women, possibly stemming from rejection or abuse. Others theorized he might have worked in retail and harbored resentment toward the industry. These psychological profiles, while speculative, provided investigators with potential avenues to explore. In the absence of definitive answers, rumors and theories proliferated. Some speculated the killer might have been incarcerated for another crime, explaining the cessation of murders after 1993. Others suggested he might have died, either by suicide or natural causes. Still others proposed he might have continued killing, but changed his methodology to avoid detection. Without concrete evidence, these theories remained just that, theories. The I-70 case also highlighted the challenges of investigating serial murders that cross jurisdictional boundaries. Before the advent of national databases and improved communication between law enforcement agencies, it was difficult to connect crimes committed in different states. The I-70 task force represented an early example of multi-jurisdictional cooperation in a serial murder investigation, setting a precedent for future cases. As forensic technology advanced, investigators periodically re-examined the physical evidence collected from the crime scenes. They hoped that new techniques might reveal details that were previously undetectable. Items like bullet fragments, shell casings, and any potential DNA samples were preserved for future analysis. The development of the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, NIBIN, offered new tools for connecting crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. The advent of these national databases meant that any new arrests for crimes involving .22 caliber weapons could potentially be cross-referenced with the ballistic evidence from the I-70 cases. Similarly, if the killer was ever arrested and had his DNA entered into CODIS, there was a possibility of connecting him to any biological evidence recovered from the crime scenes, however minimal it might be. In 2013, more than 2 decades after the original murders, the case saw renewed interest. Investigators from the various jurisdictions involved in the I-70 task force met to review the evidence using contemporary investigative techniques. They digitized old case files, re-examined witness statements, and consulted with current FBI behavioral analysts to develop an updated profile of the killer. This profile suggested that if the killer was still alive, he would be in his 50s or 60s by this time. The analysts theorized that he might have aged out of violent crime, a phenomenon observed in some serial offenders. They also suggested that major life changes, such as marriage, employment stability, or relocation to an area far from the I-70 corridor, might have contributed to the cessation of his killing spree. The updated investigation also focused on potential connections to other unsolved murders beyond those previously considered. Investigators compiled a database of unsolved homicides involving small businesses, female victims, and .22 caliber weapons, regardless of geographical location. This broader approach aimed to identify any cases that might have been overlooked in the original investigation. One such case that received renewed scrutiny was the 1992 murder of Rhonda Hinson in Caldwell County, North Carolina. Hinson was shot with a high-powered rifle while driving home from a Christmas party, a methodology distinctly different from the I-70 killings. However, the timing and the use of a firearm led some to speculate about a possible connection. After thorough examination, investigators concluded that the Hinson case was likely unrelated to the I-70 murders, given the significant differences in victim selection and methodology. The renewed investigation also benefited from advancements in criminal geographic profiling. By analyzing the locations of the confirmed I-70 and I-35 murders, analysts attempted to identify the killer's comfort zone, the area where he likely lived or worked during the time of the murders. This analysis suggested that the killer might have had connections to the Kansas City area, given its central location in relation to the various crime scenes. In 2016, the case took an intriguing turn when investigators announced they were exploring a potential connection between the I-70 killer and an unidentified serial killer known as the Gilgo Beach Killer, responsible for a series of murders in Long Island, New York. The Gilgo Beach murders, discovered between 2010 and 2011, involved the remains of several women found along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. The potential connection was based on several factors. Both killers targeted vulnerable individuals, women working alone in the I-70 cases, sex workers in the Gilgo Beach cases. Both appeared to have knowledge of police procedures, and both managed to evade capture despite extensive investigations. Additionally, some investigators noted that the I-70 killer's crimes stopped around the same time that the earliest estimated dates for some of the Gilgo Beach victims' disappearances. However, this theory faced significant skepticism from other law enforcement officials. The victims' profiles were markedly different, as were the methods of killing and disposal of bodies. The geographical distance between the Midwest and Long Island also posed challenges to the theory. After thorough investigation, including attempts to match DNA evidence from both cases, authorities concluded that there was insufficient evidence to link the I-70 killer to the Gilgo Beach murders. In 2019, the St. Charles Police Department in Missouri announced they were utilizing genetic genealogy to potentially identify the I-70 killer. This investigative technique, which had gained prominence following the identification of the Golden State Killer in 2018, involves comparing DNA evidence from crime scenes to commercial genetic databases where individuals have voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles. The challenge with applying genetic genealogy to the I-70 case was the limited amount of DNA evidence available. Unlike many modern crime scenes, where investigators routinely collect and preserve biological materials, the I-70 crime scenes from 1992 yielded minimal DNA evidence. Any samples that were collected had been subjected to decades of storage, potentially degrading their quality and usefulness for genetic analysis. Despite these challenges, investigators remained hopeful that even partial DNA profiles might provide leads when combined with other investigative information. They worked with genetic genealogists to explore family trees of potential matches, looking for individuals who fit the physical description of the I-70 killer and had connections to the Midwest during the early 1990s. Another avenue of investigation involved revisiting the ballistic evidence. The .22 caliber weapon used in the murders was believed to be an Irma Werker ET-22, a relatively uncommon German-made pistol that resembles a Luger. This model was imported to the United States in limited quantities during the 1960s and 1970s. Investigators compiled records of registered owners of this firearm model and cross-referenced them with individuals who had connections to the areas where the murders occurred. The specificity of the weapon provided both advantages and challenges for the investigation. On one hand, the uncommon nature of the Irma Werker ET-22 narrowed the field of potential suspects. On the other hand, many of these firearms were sold through private transactions that weren't documented, making it difficult to trace ownership comprehensively. Additionally, if the killer had disposed of the weapon after completing his spree, this line of investigation would reach a dead end. In 2021, nearly 3 decades after the murders, the case saw another significant development. Investigators announced they had identified a strong person of interest in the I-70 killings. While they did not publicly name this individual, they indicated that he was incarcerated for an unrelated crime and had connections to the Midwest during the time of the murders. Law enforcement officials were working to gather sufficient evidence to bring charges against this person of interest. This announcement generated renewed public interest in the case. Media outlets revisited the I-70 murders, producing documentaries and podcast series that detailed the crimes and the decades-long investigation. These productions often included interviews with retired detectives who had worked the case, family members of the victims, and forensic experts who explained the challenges of solving such a complex serial murder case. The families of the victims expressed cautious optimism about this development. After nearly 30 years of uncertainty, the possibility of identifying the killer offered a glimmer of hope for closure. Robin Fuldauer's family, who had maintained a memorial website dedicated to her memory, issued a statement expressing their gratitude to the investigators who had continued to pursue the case over the decades. The identification of a person of interest offered them the possibility of understanding the random act of violence that had shaped their childhoods. The Texas victims' families, who had long suspected their loved ones were killed by the same perpetrator as the I-70 victims, also followed the developments closely. Marianne Glasscock, Amy Vess, and Vicky Webb, who survived her attack, had been connected to the I-70 cases through ballistic evidence and the similar methodology of the crimes. The potential identification of their attacker represented a significant step toward justice. Law enforcement officials cautioned that building a case against the person of interest would take time. The decades that had passed since the murders complicated the process of gathering admissible evidence. Witnesses had died or their memories had faded, physical evidence had degraded, and the legal standards for what constituted sufficient evidence for prosecution had evolved. Prosecutors from the various jurisdictions where the murders occurred collaborated to determine the optimal approach for bringing charges. They considered factors such as the strength of evidence in each case, the applicable statutes of limitations, though murder typically has none, and the strategic advantages of trying the cases separately or seeking to consolidate them. The investigation also explored the possibility that the person of interest might be responsible for additional unsolved murders beyond the confirmed I-70 and I-35 cases. Investigators reviewed cold cases from across the country, looking for similarities in methodology, victim selection, and ballistic evidence. This broader approach aimed to ensure that if the person of interest was indeed the I-70 killer, he would be held accountable for all of his crimes. As the investigation continued, criminologists and forensic psychologists studied the case as an example of how serial killers can evade capture through mobility and jurisdictional fragmentation. The I-70 killer's use of interstate highways to move between targets demonstrated a level of planning that complicated the investigation. His targeting of small businesses in different states meant that local law enforcement agencies initially treated the murders as isolated incidents rather than the work of a serial offender. The case also illustrated the evolution of investigative techniques over 3 decades. What began as a traditional investigation relying on witness statements, ballistic evidence, and behavioral profiling had transformed into a multifaceted approach, incorporating DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, advanced geographic profiling, and comprehensive digital databases of criminal information. In late 2021, another significant development occurred when investigators publicly identified their primary person of interest as Silas Dwayne Boston, a man who had died in 2013 while awaiting trial for an unrelated murder. Boston had a history of violence and had lived in the Midwest during the time of the I-70 killings. He also bore a resemblance to the composite sketch created based on the Wichita witness's description. However, this identification was met with skepticism from some quarters. Critics pointed out that Boston had been in custody in California during some of the periods when the I-70 killer was active in the Midwest. Additionally, while Boston had a history of violence, his known crimes differed significantly in methodology from the I-70 murders. These discrepancies led some investigators to continue exploring alternative suspects. Another theory that gained traction involved a connection to the Colonial Parkway murders, a series of killings that occurred along the Colonial Parkway in Virginia between 1986 and 1989. Some investigators noted similarities in the geographic mobility of the perpetrators and the apparent knowledge of police procedures. However, the significant differences in victim selection and methodology. The Colonial Parkway killer targeted couples in vehicles, while the I-70 killer focused on individuals in retail establishments, made a definitive connection unlikely. As the investigation continued into 2022, the 30th anniversary of the I-70 murders prompted renewed media coverage and public interest. Law enforcement agencies held press conferences to update the public on the status of the investigation, reiterating their commitment to solving the case despite the challenges posed by the passage of time. The families of the victims used the anniversary to advocate for continued attention to the case. They shared memories of their loved ones, emphasizing that the victims were more than just names in a decades-old murder investigation. Robin Fuldauer was remembered as a dedicated employee with a bright future ahead of her. Patricia Smith and Patricia Magers were recalled as hard-working women who had formed a friendship through their work at Labradal. Michael McCown was described as a devoted son who had stepped in to help at his mother's ceramics shop. Nancy Kitzmiller was remembered for her adventurous spirit and love of the outdoors. Sarah Blessing was honored as a caring mother and creative soul who had found joy in her work at the store of many colors. The Texas victims were similarly commemorated. Mary Ann Glasscock was remembered as a knowledgeable antique dealer with a passion for history. Amy Vess was recalled as a talented dancer who had found fulfillment in helping others pursue their passion through her work at the dancewear shop. Vicky Webb, the survivor, continued to advocate for victims of violent crime, using her experience to help others navigate the trauma of survival. In early 2023, investigators announced another significant development. They had identified a new suspect in the I-70 cases, distinct from Silas Dwayne Boston. This individual, whose name was not publicly disclosed, had connections to both the Midwest and Texas during the periods when the murders occurred. Unlike Boston, this suspect's whereabouts during the relevant time frames aligned with the timing of the killings. Additionally, the suspect had knowledge of firearms and access to a .22 caliber weapon, similar to the one used in the murders. law enforcement officials indicated they were building a case against this new suspect, gathering evidence that would meet the standards for prosecution. They were exploring various avenues, including potential DNA matches, ballistic comparisons, and circumstantial evidence linking the suspect to the locations of the murders. The identification of this new suspect represented the most promising development in the case in decades. While investigators remained cautious about publicly declaring they had solved the case, their statements reflected a growing confidence that they were finally closing in on the I-70 killer after more than 30 years. For the families of the victims, this development offered the possibility of closure after decades of uncertainty. They had lived with unanswered questions for a generation. Why were their loved ones targeted? What kind of person could commit such seemingly random acts of violence? Would they ever see justice served? The identification of a viable suspect brought them closer to answers than they had been since the murders occurred. The I-70 case stands as a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the enduring impact of violent crime on families and communities. It demonstrates how advances in forensic technology and investigative techniques can breathe new life into cold cases, offering hope for resolution even decades after the crimes were committed. As the investigation continues, the legacy of the I-70 killer case extends beyond the pursuit of a single perpetrator. It has influenced how law enforcement agencies approach cross-jurisdictional investigations, highlighted the importance of maintaining cold case units, and underscored the value of preserving evidence for future analysis using technologies that may not yet exist. The case also serves as a reminder of the human cost of violent crime. Behind the headlines and case files are the stories of individuals whose lives were cut short and families whose trajectories were forever altered by acts of senseless violence. Their memories continue to drive the pursuit of justice, even as decades pass and challenges mount. While the I-70 killer case remains officially unsolved as of this recording, the recent developments suggest that closure may finally be within reach. After 30 years of investigation, thousands of leads, and countless hours of detective work, the identity of the person who terrorized the Midwest in the spring of 1992 may soon be known. For the families of Robin Fuldauer, Patricia Smith, Patricia Magers, Michael McCown, Nancy Kitzmiller, Sarah Blessing, and the Texas victims, that knowledge would represent a long-awaited step toward healing and justice. The I-70 killer case reminds us that in the pursuit of justice, time may be an obstacle, but it is not an insurmountable one. With dedication, technological advancement, and a refusal to let the memories of victims fade, even the most perplexing criminal cases can move closer to resolution. As this investigation continues to unfold, it stands as a powerful example of how the passage of time does not diminish the importance of holding violent offenders accountable for their actions, no matter how many years have passed since their crimes were committed.